All right, so how did you get on with that challenge? Was it easy? Was it hard? If it was really easy and you've managed to complete everything and you've gotten it to look like this, then feel free to just skip this lesson and continue in the curriculum. But if you got stuck at a certain point, or if you want to see me go through the solution, then continue watching and let's run through the solution together. First step is easy enough. Create a new React app. We've done this a million times. So let's go ahead and just do that quickly. As always, let's just start out by rendering a H1 and just check to see that it actually works and it gets shown on screen in the element with ID of root. And once we can see it in there, then we can go ahead and continue on to the next step. So we're going to be creating a app.jsx component. Now notice how in the instructions, I've always added the JSX extension for the file names. Now this currently is a point of contention. The official Airbnb style guide, which a lot of people follow for creating React components, advises us to do this. And the reason is because when you have these files, say Atlassian Bitbucket or some other services, it needs to recognize this extension in order to highlight the syntax in the correct way. But actually, in terms of the functionality for React apps, you can actually just leave it as app.js and have all of your files just as JavaScript files. So this is something that a lot of people argue about, and I've recently started removing the X from my app.js files as well. But at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. As long as you pick one and you stick to it and you're consistent about it, then that's absolutely fine. So in order to create a app.js component, I'm already going to start creating a components folder. And that way I can create my new app.js file inside my components folder. And inside here, I'm going to be creating the very root of my component tree. So I'm going to import React from React. And then I'm going to create a functional component called app. And this is going to simply return a div. And inside this div, let's just make sure that it works. Again, let's create an H1 called hello app to differentiate it from the old content. And then let's go ahead and export this as the default. So the only thing that we actually have inside this file is just our app function. So it makes sense to export it just as the default export. Now let's hit save and let's head back to our index.js. Instead of rendering our H1 hello world, I'm going to render that app component that we built just now. But in order for it to be recognized, we of course have to import it. So import app from ./components/app. And I'm going to leave off the JS at the end. Now you can see it's working because we can see hello app instead of hello world. So now we can tick off step 2. Step 3 is to create a header JSX component that renders a header element. So again, that means we're going to be creating a new component inside our already created components folder, and it's going to be called header.jsx. Now inside our header.jsx, we're going to do all the classic things that we always have to do inside any component, which is to import and then create the component, which is a header function. And then we're going to export it as the default. The header is going to be inserted into the app component instead of the H1. And inside this header component, we need to render a header element and a keeper app name inside an H1. So instead of returning nothing, let's go ahead and return a header element. And remember that the HTML elements are lowercase and our custom components are always capitalized with Pascal case. So this way, React can differentiate when you are trying to use a custom React component versus when you're just trying to tap into the native HTML elements. Inside this header HTML element, I'm going to create an H1 element, and this is just going to say keeper because that's what I'm going to name my app. You might name it something else, it really doesn't matter, but now we're going to try and render this header component inside our app.js instead of this H1 right here. So let's go ahead and add this as a self-closing tag. And in order for us to use it, we of course have to import the header component from the ./header file. And now once we refresh our website, you can see that our header has gone in with all of the styling and all of the bells and whistles. And the reason for this is because inside our public folder, we've got a styles.css file, which says that the header elements should always have a yellow background. It has this margin padding and the box shadow at the bottom. The H1 elements inside a header component should have this color and the McLaren font family. So we're seeing all of these styles being applied just because we are using the same HTML elements which are being targeted in our CSS. If in your case you don't see the styling being applied, then it might be because you're actually not using the elements that are being targeted in your styles.css. If this was something that you got stuck on, then it might be a chance to go back to your code and see if you can continue the challenge with this knowledge in hand. Now that we've completed step 3, it's time to move on to step 4. And step 4 is to create a footer component that renders a footer element to show a copyright message with a dynamically updated year. So let's go and create a new footer.jsx and do all of the housekeeping. And in terms of the footer, all we want to return is just a simple paragraph element. But the paragraph element is hopefully going to write some text dynamically. So it's going to say something like copyright, and then maybe you can add in the copyright symbol if you wanted to. You can either copy it from here, or you can search in Google for the copyright symbol and just copy it from here. Either way, you should be able to get that symbol. But the important part is that in the instructions, we mentioned that we wanted a dynamically created year. So instead of just typing in 2019, in which case it's going to be out of date pretty soon. And there are developers who feel really strongly about hating on websites that don't have a dynamic footer. There's even a website created called updateyourfooter.com so that you have a dynamic timestamp. And they've got JavaScript snippets, PHP snippets, basically trying to encourage web developers to always use a dynamic year in their footer. So we already know how to create a dynamic year, right? We create a new date object with JavaScript, and then we use the getFullYear method. So let's go ahead and apply it in our code. You can either do this inline right here, using a set of JSX curly braces, or you can create a constant here called current year maybe, and set it to equal a new date object, and then we get full year, call that method in order to store it inside this constant, and then you can just insert it in here. Alternatively, you could have it inline by just putting this code inside here, of course. Now the proof is really in the pudding, so let's go ahead and save our footer.jsx and import it into our app and render it just below the header, like so. And if you have the same appearance as I have and you're miffed as to how can I get it down at the bottom, how can I get it this particular color, well, it's probably because we're not actually applying any styling to the text in our footer. So in order to investigate, you can head into the styles.css and see how these styles are being targeted. So for example, notice how we've got a position absolute text align center, which should theoretically center a HTML element, but notice how that is targeting a footer HTML element. And also the text color of this kind of gray color that you see here is targeting paragraph elements inside a footer element. So it's really likely that you might have had the same problem because it's very easy enough to just render a paragraph tag. But if you're not getting the styling, it might be because you're not wrapping it inside a footer element, which is what is used inside the styles.css in order to convey all of this styling, the centering and the color, etc. So that's a common source of confusion. But now we've completed step 4, and all we have left is to create a note component and style the note component. The note component is probably going to go in between the header and the footer in the middle here. So let's go ahead and create this new note.jsx component, import React from React, export it as the default, and let's think about what it is that we need to write in order to create a new note. So we want to have a H1 and a paragraph, which is going to denote the title and the content stored inside a div group. And this is a very common way of grouping a component using a single divider, right? Let's go ahead and add an H1, which we'll just call, this is the title. And then let's add a paragraph. This is the content. And it doesn't really matter what you put in here as long as you've got some content that can be shown on screen. Now let's go into our app.js, import our note, and add it in between the header and the footer. So here it is. But why does that not look like this? Well, we need to look for clues inside the stars.css. Here, you'll notice that there is a class style called note, and it defines things such as a box shadow, a border radius, padding, and how it should be arranged. And then we've also got styles for H1s associated with the note class, paragraphs associated with the note class. So it seems like we need to apply this class style to our note component. This is a quick tip. You might think that you can actually apply the style inside your custom component. You might say something like class name. Remember, that's the React way of targeting a particular CSS class. And class name equals note, right? But unfortunately, this does not actually do what you expect it to do. That note style is not, in fact, being applied. And we're going to learn about this a little bit later on when we learn about React properties. But essentially, whenever you're applying a HTML attribute such as class name or style or onClick or all of those things, they shouldn't go into your custom component. So the components that you've created, like note or header or footer. Instead, they need to be applied to a HTML element, such as our div here. So if I go ahead and add my class name right here with the name of note, you'll see that this now works predictably. And we're going to be talking about this a little bit later on. So remember that when you're using HTML attributes, they can only be applied to HTML elements, even if it's inside the JSX and not your custom created React elements. So now that we've completed everything in our challenge, we can take a look at the final website we've created using what we've learned about React. And you can see that it looks pretty much exactly the same as the sample app that I gave you to compare against. How did you get on with this challenge? If there was anything that was confusing, I recommend to just take a moment and play around with the code and change some things or switch things around just so that you really get to grips with it before moving on. This is kind of a checkpoint or a save point, if you will, and it's a good idea to even just take a break and have a think about it before you move on. But once you're done, then head back, and in the next lesson, we're going to be learning about React properties. So for all of that and more, I'll see you there.